Hello, guys. Welcome to Psyched Minds. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like, and share if you like them. We are currently reading We the Living by Anne Rand, chapter 16th. At first, there were whispers. Students gathered in groups in dark corners and jerked their heads nervously at every approaching newcomer, and in their whispers, one heard the words, "The Purge." In lines at cooperatives and in tramways, people asked, "Have you heard about the purge?" In the columns of Pravda, there appeared many mentions of the deplorable state of red colleges and of the coming purge. And then, at the end of the winter semester, in the Technological Institute, in the university, and in all the institutes of higher education, there appeared a large notice with huge letters in red pencil, "The Purge." The notice directed all students to call at the office, receive questionnaires, fill them out promptly, have their Apravdom certify on the truth of the answers, and return them to the purging committee. The schools of the unions of socialist Soviet republics were to be cleaned of all socially undesirable persons. Those found socially undesirable were to be expelled, never to be admitted to any college again. Newspapers roared over the country like trumpets. Science is a weapon of the class struggle. Proletarian schools are for the proletariat. We shall not educate our class enemies. There were those who were careful not to let these trumpets be heard too loudly across the border. Kira received her questionnaire at the institute and Leo his at the university. They sat silently at their dinner table filling out the answers. They did not eat much dinner that night. I think that's it. When they signed the questionnaires, they knew they had signed the death warrant of their future. But they did not say it aloud and they did not look at each other. The main questions were: who were your parents? What was your father's occupation prior to the year 1917? What was your father's occupation from the year 1917 to the year 1921? What is your father's occupation now? What is your mother's occupation? What did you do during the Civil War? What did your father do during the Civil War? Are you a trade union member? Are you a member of the All Union Communist Party? Any attempt to give a false answer was futile. The answers were to be investigated by the purging committee and the GPU. A false answer was to be punished by arrest, imprisonment, or any penalty up to the supreme one. Kira's hands trembled a little when she handed to the purge committee the questionnaire that bore the answer, "What was your father's occupation prior to the year 1917? Owner of the Argonov textile factory." What awaited those who were to be expelled, no one dared to think. No one mentioned it. The questionnaires were turned in, and the students waited for a call from the committee, waited silently, nerves tense as wires. In the long corridors of the colleges where the troubled stream of students clotted into restless cluster, they whispered that one's social origin was most important, that if you were of bourgeois descent, you didn't have a chance, that if your parents had been wealthy, you were still a class enemy, even though you were starving, and that you must try if you could, at the price of your immortal soul, if you had one, to prove your origin from the workbench or the plough. There were more leather jackets and red kerchiefs and sunflower seed shells in the college corridors, and jokes about my parents, why they were a peasant woman and two workers. It was spring again, and melting snow drilled the sidewalks, and blue hyacinths were sold on street corners. But those who were young had no thought left for spring, and those who still thought were not young any longer. Kira Argonova, head high, stood before the purge committee of the Technological Institute. At the table among the men of the committee whom she did not know sat three persons she knew: Comrade Sonia, Pavel Syrov, Andrei Taganov. It was Pavel Syrov who did most of the questioning. Her questionnaire lay on the table before him. "So, Citizen Argonova, your father was a factory owner?" "Yes." "I see. And your mother? Did she work before the revolution?" "No." "I see. Did you employ servants in your home?" "Yes." "I see. Comrade Sonia asked, "And you have never joined a trade union, Citizen Argonova? Didn't find it desirable?" "I have never had the opportunity." "I see." Andrei Taganov listened. His face did not move. His eyes were cold, steady, impersonal, as if he had never seen Kira before. And suddenly she felt an inexplicable pity for him, for that immobility and what it hid, although he showed not the slightest sign of what it hid. When he asked her a question suddenly, even though his voice was hard and his eyes empty, the question was a plea. "But you have always been in strict sympathy with the Soviet government, Citizen Argonova, haven't you?" She answered very softly, "Yes." Somewhere around a lamp, late in the night, amid rustling papers, reports, and documents, a committee was holding a conference. Factory owners were the chief exploiters of the proletariat, worse than landowners, most dangerous of class enemies. "We are performing a great service to the cause of revolution, and no personal feelings are to interfere with our duty. Order from Moscow: children of former factory owners are in the first category to be expelled." A voice asked, weighing every word. "Any exceptions to that rule, Comrade Taganov?" He stood by a window, his hands clasped behind his back. He answered, "None." The names of those expelled were typewritten on a long sheet of paper and posted on a blackboard in the office of the Technological Institute. Kira had expected it, but when she saw the name on the list, Argonova Kira, she closed her eyes and looked again and read the long list carefully to make sure. Then she noticed that her briefcase was open. She clasped the catch carefully. She looked at the hole in her glove and stuck her finger out, trying to see how far it would go, and twisted an unraveled thread into a little snake and watched it uncoil. Then she felt that someone was watching her. She turned. Andrei stood alone in a window niche. He was looking at her, but he did not move forward. He did not say a word. He did not incline his head in greeting. She knew what he feared, what he hoped, what he was waiting for. She walked to him and looked up at him and extended her hand with the same trusting smile he had known on the same young lips, only the lips trembled a little. "It's all right, Andre. I know you couldn't help it." She had not expected a gratitude like pain in his low voice when he answered, "I would give you my place if I could." "Oh, it's all right. Well, I guess I won't be a builder after all. I guess I won't build any aluminium bridges." She tried to laugh. "It's all right, because everybody always told me one can't build a bridge of aluminium anyway." She noticed that it was harder for him to smile than for her. "And Andre," she said softly, knowing that he did not dare to ask it, "this doesn't mean that we won't see each other anymore, does it?" He took her hands in both of his. "It doesn't, Kira. Well, then it doesn't. Give me your phone number and address so I can call you, because we won't meet here anymore. We are such good friends that, isn't it funny? I have never even known your address. All's for the best, maybe. Maybe we'll be better friends now." When she came home, Leo was sprawled across the bed and he didn't get up. He looked at her and laughed. He laughed dryly, monotonously, senselessly. She stood still, looking at him. "Thrown out?" he asked, rising on a wavering elbow, his hair falling over his face. "Don't have to tell me, I know. You're kicked out, like a dog. So am I. Like two dogs. Congratulations, Kira Alexandrovna. Hearty proletarian congratulations." "Leo, you've been drinking." "Sure, to celebrate. All of us did. Dozens and dozens of us at the university. A toast to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Many toasts to the dictatorship of the proletariat." "Don't stare at me like that. It's a good old custom to drink at births and weddings and funerals. Well, we weren't born together, Comrade Argonova, and we have never had a wedding, Comrade Argonova, but we might yet see the other. We might yet the other, Kira." She was on her knees by the bed, gathering to her breast a pale face with a contorted wound of a mouth. She was brushing damp hair off his forehead. She was whispering, Leo, dearest, you shouldn't do that. Now's the time you shouldn't. We have to think clearly now. She was whispering without conviction. It's not dangerous so long as we don't give up. You must take care of yourself, Leo. You must spare yourself. His mouth spat out. For what? Kira met Vasily Ivanovich in the street. It took an effort to not let her face show the change of his. She had seen him but once since Maria Petrovna's death, and he had not looked like that. He walked like an old man, his clear, proud eyes darted at every face, a bitter look of suspicion and hatred and shame. His wrinkled, sinewy hands tottered uncertainly in the useless movements, like an old woman's. Two lines were slashed from the corners of his lips out to his chin, lines of such suffering that one felt guilty of intrusion for having seen and guessed. Kira, glad to see you again. Glad to see you, he muttered, his voice, his words clinging to her helplessly. Why don't you come over any more? It's sort of lonesome at home. Or maybe you have heard and don't want to come. She had not heard, but something in his voice told her not to ask him what it was that she could have heard. She said with her warmest smile, Why no, Uncle Vasily, I'll be glad to come. It's just that I've been working so hard, but I'll be over tonight, may I? She did not ask about Irina and Victor and whether they too had been expelled, as after an earthquake all were looking around cautiously, counting the victims, afraid to ask questions. That night after dinner, she called on the Dunaevs. She had persuaded Leo to go to bed. He had a fever. His cheekbones flamed with bright red spots. She had left a jug of cold tea by the bed and told him that she would be back early. At the bare table without tablecloth, under a lamp without a shade, Vasily Ivanovich sat reading an old volume of Chekhov. Irina, her hair uncombed, sat drawing senseless figures on a huge sheet of paper. Asya slept, fully dressed, curled in an armchair in a corner. In a dark corner, a rusty Burgoi smoked. Hello, said Irina, her lips twisting. Kira had never seen her smile like that. Would you like some tea, Kira? Hot tea. Only we have no saccharine left. No, thank you. Uncle Vasily, I have just had dinner. Well, said Irina. Why don't you say it? Expelled? Kira nodded. And Leo too? Kira nodded. Well, why don't you ask? Oh, I'll tell you myself, sure. I'm out. What could you expect? Daughter of the wealthy court furrier. And Victor? Irina and Vasily Ivanovich exchanged a strange glance. No, Irina answered slowly. Victor is not expelled. I'm glad, Uncle Vasily. What's good news, isn't it? That's good news, isn't it? She knew the best way to cheer her uncle. Victor's such a talented young man. I'm glad they have spared his future. Yes, Vasily Ivanovich said slowly, bitterly. Victor is such a talented young man. She had a white lace gown. Irina said hysterically. And really, she has a gorgeous voice. Oh, I mean, I'm speaking of the new production of La Traviata at the Mikhailovsky Theatre, and you have seen it, of course. Oh, well, you must see it. Old classics are. Yes, said Vasily Ivanovich. Old classics are still the best in those days. They had culture and moral values and integrity. Really? Said Kira, nervous and bewildered. I'll have to see La Traviata. In the last act, said Irina. In the last act, oh hell, she threw her drawing board down with a crash that awakened Asya, who sat up staring, blinking. You will hear it sooner or later. Victor has joined the party. Kira was holding the book of Chekhov and it clattered down to the floor. What? He joined the party. The All-Union Communist Party, with a red star, party ticket, a bread card, and his hand in all the blood spilled, in all the blood to come. Irina, how could he get admitted? She was afraid to look at Vasily Ivanovich. She knew she should not ask questions that were like knives turned in a wound. But she could not resist it. Oh, it seems he had it planned for a long time. He's been making friends carefully and judiciously. He's been a candidate for months, and we never knew it. Then he got admitted. Oh, they accepted him all right, with the kind of sponsor he had selected to watch for his proletarian spirit, even though his father did sell furs to this czar. Did he know this? The purge, I mean, was coming. Oh, don't be silly, it isn't that. Of course, he didn't know that in advance. He's aiming higher than merely to keep his place at the institute. Oh, my brother Victor is a brilliant young man. When he wants to climb, he knows the stepping stones. Well, Kira tried to smile to say for Vasily Ivanovich's sake, without looking at him. It's Victor's business. He knows what he wants. Is he is he still here? If it were up to me, Irina checked herself abruptly. Yes, the swine's still here. Irina, Vasily Ivanovich said wearily. He's your brother. Kira changed the subject, but it was not easy to keep up a conversation. Half an hour later, Victor came in. The dignity of his expression and the red star in his lapel was very much in evidence. Victor, said Kira, I hear you are a good communist now. I have had the honor of joining the All Union Communist Party, Victor answered, and I'll have it understood that the party is not to be referred to lightly. Oh, said Kira, I see. But it happened that she did not see Victor's extended hand when she was leaving. At the door in the lobby, Irina whispered to her, At first I thought father would throw him out, but with mother gone and all, and you know how he's always been crazy about Victor, well, he thinks he'll try to be broad-minded. I think it will break him. For God's sake, Kira, come often. He likes you. Because there was no future, they hung on to the present. There were days when Leo sat for hours reading a book and hardly spoke to Kira, and when he spoke, his smile held a bitter, endless contempt for himself, for the world, for eternity. Once she found him drunk, leaning against the table, staring intently at a broken glass on the floor. Leo, where did you get it? Borrowed it. Borrowed it from our dear neighbor, Comrade Marisha. She always has plenty. Leo, why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I? Who in this whole damn world can tell me why I shouldn't? But there were days when a new calm suddenly cleared his eyes and his smile. He waited for Kira to come home from work, and when she entered, he drew her hastily into his arms. They could sit through an evening without a word, their presence, a glance, the pressure of a hand drugging them into security, making them forget the coming morning, all the coming mornings. Arm in arm, they walked through silent, luminous streets in the white nights of spring. The sky was like dull glass, glowing with a sunless radiance from somewhere beyond. The cloud, the could They could look at each other at the still steepest city in the strange milky light. He pressed her arm close to his, and when they were alone on a long street dawn bright and empty, he bent to kiss her. Kira's step was steady. There were too many cushions ahead, but here, beside her, were the things that gave her certainty. His straight, tense body, his long, thin hands, his haughty mouth with the arrogant smile that answered all the cushions. And sometimes she felt pity for those countless nameless ones somewhere around them who, in a feverish quest, were searching for some answer, and in their search crushed others, perhaps even her. But she could not be crushed, for she had the answer. She did not wonder about the future. The future was Leo. Leo was too pale and he was silent too often. The blue on his temples looked like veins in marbles. He coughed, choking. He took cough medicine, which did not help, and refused to see a doctor. Kira saw Andre frequently. She had asked Leo if he minded it. Not at all, he had answered. If he's your friend, only would you mind? Don't bring him here. I'm not sure I can be polite to one of them. She did not bring Andre to the house. She telephoned him on Sundays and smiled cheerfully into the receiver. Feel like seeing me, Andre? 2 o'clock, Summer Garden, the quay entrance. They sat on a bench with the oak leaves fighting the glare of the sun above their heads, and they talked of philosophy. She smiled sometimes when she realized that Andre was the only one with whom she could think and talk about thoughts. They had no reason for meeting each other, yet they met and made dates to meet again. And she felt strangely comfortable, and he laughed at her short summer dresses, and his laughter was strangely happy. Once he invited her to spend a Sunday in the country. She had stayed in the city all summer. She could not refuse. Leo had found a job for Sunday, breaking the wooden bricks of pavements, with a gang repairing the streets. He did not object to her excursion. In the country, she found a smooth sea sparkling in the sun, and a golden sand wind pleated into faint even waves, and the tall red candles of pines, their convulsed roots naked to the sand and wind, cones rolling to meet the seashells. Kira and Andre had a swimming race, which she won. But when they raced down the beach in their bathing suits, sand flying from under their heels, spurting sand and water at the peaceful Sunday tourists, Andre won. He caught her and they rolled down together, a whirl of legs, arms, and mutts into the lunch basket of a matron who shrieked with terror. They disentangled themselves from each other and sat there screaming with laughter. And when the matron struggled to her feet, gathered her lunch, and waddled away, grumbling something about this vulgar modern youth that can't keep their love affairs to themselves, they laughed louder. They had dinner in a dirty little country restaurant, and Kira spoke English to the waiter who could not understand a word, but bowed low and stuttered and spilled water all over the table in his eagerness to serve the first comrade foreigner in their forgotten corner. When they were leaving, Andre gave him twice the price of their dinner. The waiter bowed to the ground, convinced that he was dealing with genuine foreigners. Kira could not help looking a little startled. Andre laughed when they went out. Why not? Might as well make a waiter happy. I make more money than I can spend on myself anyway. In the train, as it clattered into the evening in the smoke of the city, Andre asked, Kira, when will I see you again? I'll call you. No, I want to know now. In a few days. No, I want a definite day. Well then, Wednesday night. All right. After work at 5:30 at the summer garden. All right. When she came home, she found Leo asleep in a chair, his hands dust streaked, smears of dust on his damp, flushed face, his dark lashes blond with dust, his body limp with exhaustion. She washed his face and helped him to undress. He coughed. The 2 evenings that followed were long, furious arguments, but Leo surrendered. He promised to visit a doctor on Wednesday. Vava Milovskaya had a date with Victor for Wednesday night. Wednesday afternoon, Victor telephoned her, his voice impatiently apologetic. He was detained on urgent business at the institute and would not be able to see her. Urgent business had detained him the last 3 times he had promised to come. Vava had heard rumors, she had heard a name, she knew what to suspect. In the evening, she dressed carefully. She pulled a wide black patent leather belt around belt tight around the slim waist of her best slim waist of her best new white coat. She touched her lips faintly, cautiously with her new foreign lipstick. She slipped on her foreign celluloid bracelet. She tilted her white hat recklessly over her black curls and told her mother that she was going out to call on Mikira Gorgonova. She hesitated on the stair landing before Kira's apartment, and her hand trembled a little when she pressed the bell. The tenant opened the door. To see Citizen Argonova. This way, comrade, he told her. You have to pass through Citizen Lavrova's room. This door here. Resolutely, Vava jerked the door open without knocking. They were there, together, Marisha and Victor, bending over the gramophone that played The Fire of Moscow. Victor's face was cold, silent fury. But Vava did not look at him. She tossed her head up and said to Marisha, as proudly, as dramatically as she could, in a shaking voice, swallowing tears, I beg your pardon, citizen. I'm just calling on Citizen Argonova. Surprised and suspecting nothing, Marisha pointed to Kira's door with her thumb. Head high, Vava walked across the room. Marisha could not understand why Victor left in such a hurry. Kira was not at home, but Leo was. Kira had had a restless day. Leo had promised to telephone her at the office and tell her the doctor's diagnosis. He had not called. She telephoned him 3 times. There was no answer. On her way home, she remembered that it was a Wednesday night and that she had a date with Andre. She could not keep him waiting indefinitely at a public parked gate. She would drop by the summer garden and tell him that she couldn't stay. She reached the garden on time. Andre was not there. She looked up and down the darkening quay. She peered into the trees and shadows of the garden. She waited. Twice she asked a militia man what time it was. She waited. She could not understand it. He did not come. When she finally went home, she had waited for an hour. She clutched her hands angrily in her pockets. She could not worry about Andre when she thought of Leo and the doctor and of what she still had to hear. She hurried up the stairs. She darted through Marisha's room and flung the door open. On the Davenport, her white coat trailing to the floor, Vawa was clasped in Leo's arms, their lips locked together. Kira stood looking at them calmly, an amazed question in her lifted eyebrows. They jumped up. Leo was not very steady. He had been drinking again. He stood swaying with his bitter, contemptuous smile. Vawa's face went a dark purplish red. She opened her mouth, choking without a sound, and as no one said a word, she screamed suddenly into the silence. You think it's terrible, don't you? Well, I think so too. It's terrible. It's vile. Only I don't care. I don't care what I do. I don't care anymore. I'm rotten. Well, I'm not the only one. Only I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. She burst into hysterical sobs and rushed out, slamming the door. The two others did not move. He sneered. Well, say it, she answered slowly. I have nothing to say. Listen, you might as well get used to it. You might as well get used to it that you can't have me. Because you can't have me. You won't have me. You won't have me long. Leo, what did the doctor say? He laughed. Plenty. What is it you have? Nothing, not a thing. Leo! Not a thing, yet. But I'm going to have it. Just a few weeks longer. I'm going to have it. What, Leo? He swayed with a grand gesture. Nothing much, just tuberculosis. The doctor asked, Are you his wife? Kira hesitated, then answered, No. The doctor said, I see. Then he added, Well, I suppose you have a right to know it. Citizen Kovalensky is in a very bad condition. We call it incipient tuberculosis. It can still be stopped now. In a few weeks, it will be too late. In a few weeks, he'll have tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a serious disease, citizen. In Soviet Russia, it is a fatal disease. It is strongly advisable to prevent it. If you let it start, you will not be likely to stop it. You will not be likely to stop it. What does he need? Rest, plenty of it, sunshine, fresh air, food, human food. He needs a sanatorium for this coming winter. One more winter in Petrograd would be as certain as a firing squad. You will have to send him south. She did not answer, but the doctor smiled ironically, for he heard the answer without words, and he looked at the patches on her shoes. If that young man is dear to you, he said, send him south. If you have a human possibility or an inhuman one, send him south. Kira was very calm when she walked home. When she came in, Leo was standing by the window. He turned slowly. His face was so profoundly, serenely tranquil that he looked younger. He looked as if he had had his first night of rest. He asked quietly, Where have you been, Kira? At the doctor's. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want you to know all that. He told me. Kira, I'm sorry about last night. About that little fool. I hope you didn't think that I... Of course I didn't. I understand. I think it's because I was frightened. But I'm not. Now. Everything seems so much simpler. When there's a limit set, the thing to do now, Kira, is not to talk about it. Let's not think about it. There's nothing we can do. As the doctor probably told you, we can still be together for a while. When it becomes contagious, well, she was watching him. Such was his manner of accepting his death sentence. She said, and her voice was hard, Nonsense, Leo. You're going south. In the first state hospital she visited, the official in charge told her, A place in a sanatorium in the Crimea? He is not a member of the party, and he is not a member of the trade union, and he is not a state employee. You're joking, citizen. In the second hospital, the official said, We have hundreds on our waiting list, citizen, trade union members, advanced cases. No, we cannot even register him. In the third hospital, the official refused to see her. There were lines to wait in, ghastly lines of deformed creatures, of scars and slings and crutches and open sores and green mucus patches of eyes and grunts and groans, and over a line of the living, the smell of the morgue. There were state medical headquarters to visit, long hours of waiting in dim, damp corridors that smelt of carbolic acid and soiled linen. There were secretaries who forgot appointments and assistants who said, "So sorry, citizen. Next, please." There were young executives who were in a hurry and attendants who groaned, "I tell you, he's gone. It's after office hours. We gotta close. You can't sit here all night." At the end of the first 2 weeks, she learned, as firmly as if it were some mystic absolute, that if one had consumption, one had to be a member of a trade union and get a trade union dispatchment to a trade union sanatorium. There were officials to be seen, names mentioned, letters of recommendation offered, begging for an exception. There were trade union heads to visit who listened to her plea with startled, ironic glances. Some laughed, some shrugged, some called their secretaries to escort the visitor out. One said he could and he would, but he named a sum she could not earn in a year. She was firm, erect, and her voice did not tremble, and she was not afraid to beg. It was her mission, her quest, her crusade. She wondered sometimes why the words, "but he's going to die," meant so little to them, and the words, "but he's not a registered worker," meant so little to her, and why it seemed so hard to explain. She made Leo do his share of inquiries. He obeyed without arguing, without complaining, without hope. She tried everything she could. She asked Victor for help. Victor said with dignity, "My dear cousin, I want you to realize that my party membership is a sacred trust not to be used for purposes of personal advantage." She asked Marisha. Marisha laughed. "With all our sanatorium stuff like herring barrels and waiting list till the next generation and comrade workers rotting alive waiting, and he's not even sick yet. You don't realize reality, citizen Argonova." She could not call on Andre. Andre had failed her. For several days after the date he had missed, she called on Lydia with the same question. "Has Andre Taganova been here? Have you had any letters for me?" The first day Lydia said no. The second day she giggled and wanted to know what was this, a romance, and she would tell Leo, and with Leo so handsome, and Kira interrupted impatiently. "Oh, stop this rubbish, Lydia. It's important. Let me know the minute you hear from him. Will you?" Lydia did not hear from him. One evening at the Dunaives, Kira asked Victor casually if he had seen Andrei Taganova at the institute. "Sure," said Victor. "He's there every day." She was hurt. She was angry. She was bewildered. What had she done? For the first time, she questioned her own behavior. Had she acted foolishly that Sunday in the country? She tried to remember every word, every gesture. She could not find no fault. She could find no fault. He had seemed happier than ever before. After a while, she decided that she must trust their friendship and give him a chance to explain. She telephoned him. She heard the old landlady's voice yelling into the house, "Comrade Taganov," with a positive inflection, and implied his presence. There was a long pause. The landlady returned and asked, "Who's calling him?" And before she had pronounced the last syllable of her name, Kira heard the landlady barking, "He ain't home," and slamming her receiver. Kira slammed hers too. She decided to forget Andrei Taganov. It took a month, but at the end of a month, she was convinced that the door of the state sanatoriums were locked to Leo and that she could not unlock it. There were private sanatoriums in the Crimea. Private sanatoriums cost money. She would get the money. She made an appointment to see Comrade Voronov and asked for an advance on her salary, an advance of 6 months, just enough to start him off. Comrade Voronov smiled faintly and asked her how she could be certain that she would be working there another month, let alone 6. She called on Dr. Milovsky, Wawa's father, her wealthiest acquaintance, whose bank account had been celebrated by many envious whispers. Dr. Milovsky's face got very red and his short, pudgy hands waved at Kira hysterically as if shooting off a ghost. "My dear little, why, my dear little girl, what on earth made you think that I was rich or something?" "Very funny indeed. A capitalist or something." Why, we are just existing from hand to mouth, living by my own toil, like proletarian one would say, barely existing, as one would say. That's it, from hand to mouth. She knew her parents had nothing. She asked if they could try to help. Galina Petrovna cried. She asked Vasily Ivanovich. He offered her his last possession, Maria Petrovna's old fur jacket. The price of the jacket would not buy a ticket to the Crimea. She did not take it. She knew Leo would resent it, but she wrote to his aunt in Berlin. She said in her letter, I'm writing because I love him so much. To you, because I think you must love him a little. No answer came. Through mysterious, stealthy whispers, more mysterious and stealthy than the GPU who watched them sharply, she learned that there was private money to be lent, secretly and on a high percentage, but there was. She learned a name and an address. She went to the booth of a private trader in the market, where a fat man bent down to her nervously across a counter loaded with red kerchief and cotton stockings. She whispered a name. She named a sum. Business, he breathed. Speculation? She knew it was best to say yes. Well, he told her it could be arranged. The rates were 25% a month, and she nodded eagerly. What security did the citizen have to offer? Security? Surely she knew they didn't lend it on her good looks. Furs or diamonds would do. Good fur and any kind of diamonds. She had nothing to offer. The man turned away as if he had never spoken to her in his life. On her way back to the tramway through the narrow, muddy passages between the market stalls, she stopped, startled. In a little prosperous-looking booth behind a counter heavy with fresh bread loaves, smoked hams, yellow circles of butter. She saw a familiar face, a heavy red mouth under a short nose with wide vertical nostrils. She remembered the train speculator of the Nikolaevsky station with the fur-lined coat and the smell of carnation oil. He had progressed in life. He was smiling at the customers from under a fringe of salami. On her way home, she remembered someone who had said, I make more money than I can spend on myself. Did anything really matter now? She would go to the institute and try to see Andrei. She changed tramways for the institute. She saw Andrei. She saw him coming down the corridor, and he was looking straight at her, so that her lips moved in a smile of greeting, but he turned abruptly and slammed the door of an auditorium behind him. She stood frozen on the spot for a long time. When she came home, Leo was standing in the middle of the room, a crumpled paper in his hand, his face distorted by anger. So you would? He cried. So I'm meddling in my affairs now? So you are writing letters? Who asked you to write? On the table, she saw an envelope with a German stamp. It was addressed to Leo. What does she say, Leo? You want to know? You really want to know? He threw the letter at her face. She remembered only the sentence. There is no reason why you should expect any help from us. The less reason since you are living with a brazen harlot who has the impudence to write to respectable people. On the first rainy day of autumn, a delegation from a club of textile women workers visited the house of the peasant. Comrade Sonia was an honorary member of the delegation. When she saw Kira at the filing cabinet in Comrade Bitiuk's office, Comrade Sonia roared with laughter. Well, 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 a loyal citizen like Comrade Argonova in the red house of the peasant. What's the matter, comrade? Comrade Bitiuk inquired nervously, obsequiously. What's the matter? A joke, roared Comrade Sonia. A good joke? Kira shrugged with resignation. She knew what to expect. What a reduction of staff came to the house of the peasant, and she saw her name among those dismissed as antisocial element. She was not surprised. It made no difference now. She spent most of her last salary to buy eggs and milk for Leo, which he would not touch. In the daytime, Kira was calm, with the calm of an empty face, an empty heart, a mind empty of all thoughts but one. She was not afraid because she knew that Leo had to go south, and he would go, and she could not doubt it, and so she had nothing to fear. But there was the night. She felt his body, icy and moist, close to hers. She heard him coughing, sometimes in his sleep. His head fell on her shoulders, and he lay there, trusting and helpless as a child, and his breathing was like a moan. She saw the red bubble on Maria Petrovna's dying lips, and she had heard her screaming, Kira, I want to live, I want to live. She could feel Leo's breath in hot, panting gasps on her neck. Then she was not sure whether it was Maria Petrovna all Leo screaming when it was too late. Kira, I want to live. I want to live. Was she going insane? It was so simple. She just needed money, a life, his life, and money. I make more money than I can spend on myself. Kira, I want to live. I want to live. She made one last attempt to get money. She was walking down a street slippery with autumn rain, yellow lights melting on black sidewalks. The doctor had said every week counted, every day counted. She saw a resplendent limousine stopping in the orange cube of light at the theater entrance. A man stepped out, his fur coat glistened like his automobile fenders. She stood in his path. Her voice was firm and clear. Please, I want to speak to you. I need money. I don't know you. I have nothing to offer you. I know it isn't being done like this, but you will understand because it's so important. It's to save a life. The man stopped. He had never heard a plea that was a command. He asked, squinting one eye appraisingly, how much do you need? She told him, what? For one night? Why your sisters don't make that in a whole career? He could not understand why the strange girl whirled around and ran across the street, straight through the puddles as if he were going to run after her. She made one last plea to the state. It took many weeks of calls, letters, introductions, secretaries, and assistants, but she got an appointment with one of Petrograd's most powerful officials. She was to see him in person, face to face. He could do it. Between him and the power he could use stood only her ability to convince him. The official sat at his desk. A tall window rose behind him, admitting a narrow shaft of light, creating the atmosphere of a cathedral. Kira stood before him. She looked straight at him. Her eyes were not hostile, not pleading. They were clear, trusting, serene. Her voice was very calm, very simple, very young. Comrade Commissar, you see, I love him. And he is sick. You know what sickness is? It's something strange that happens in your body and then you can't stop it. And then he dies. And now his life? It depends on some words and a piece of paper. And it's so simple when you just look at it as it is. It's only something made by us, ourselves, and perhaps we are right and perhaps we are wrong, but the chance we are taking on it is frightful, isn't it? They won't send him to a sanatorium because they didn't write his name on a piece of paper with many other names and call it a membership in a trade union. It's only ink, and paper and something we think. You can write it and tear it up and write it again, but the other, that which happens in one's body, you can't stop that. You don't ask questions about that, Comrade Commissar. I know they are important, those things, money and the unions and those papers and all. And if one has to sacrifice and suffer for them, I don't mind. I don't mind if I have to work every hour of the day. I don't mind if my dress is old like this. Don't look at my dress, Comrade Commissar. I know it's ugly, but I don't mind. Perhaps I haven't always understood you and all those things, but I can be obedient and learn. Only when it comes to life itself, Comrade Commissar, then we have to be serious, don't we? We can't let those things take life. One signature of your hand and he can go to a sanatorium and he doesn't have to die. Comrade Commissar, if we just think of things calmly and simply as they are, do you know what death is? Do you know that death is nothing at all? Not at all. Never again. Never, no matter what we do. Don't you see why that he can't die? I love him. We have to suffer. We have things. We all have things we want which are taken away from us. It's all right, but because we are living beings, there's something in each of us, something like the very heart of life condensed, and that should not be touched. You understand, don't you? Well, he is that to me. And you can't take him from me because you can't let me stand here and look at you and talk and breathe and move. Then tell me you will take him. We are not insane, both of us, are we, Comrade Commissar? The Comrade Commissar said, 100,000 workers died in the Civil War. Why, in the face of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, can't one aristocrat die? Kira walked home very slowly and looked at the dark city. She looked at the glistening pavements built for many thousands of old shoes. at the tramways for men to ride in, at the stone cubes into which men crawled at night, at the posters that cried of what men dreamed and of what men ate, and she wondered whether any of those thousands of eyes around her saw what she saw, and why it had to be given. It had been given to her to see. Because in a kitchen on the fifth floor, a woman bent over a smoking stove and stirred cabbage in a kettle, and the cabbage smelled, and the woman blinked and groaned with the pain in her back and scratched her head with a spoon. Because in a corner man leaned against the bar and raised a foaming glass of beer, and the foam spilled over the floor and over his trousers, and he belched and sang a gay song. Because in a white bed on white sheets stained with yellow, a child slept and snivelled in its sleep, its nose wet. Because on a sack of flour in the basement, a man tore a woman's pants off and bit into her throat, and they rolled, moaned over the sacks of flour and potatoes. Because in the silence of stone walls, slowly dripping frozen dampness, a figure knelt before a gilded cross and raised trembling arms in exaltation and knocked a pale forehead against a cold stone floor. Because in the roar of machines, swirling lightings of steel and drops of burning grease, men swung vigorous arms and panted, heaving chests of muscles glistening with sweat, and made soap. Because in a public bath, steam rose from brass pans, and red gelatinous bodies shook, scrubbing themselves with the soap, sighing and grunting, trying to scratch steaming backs, and murky water and soap suds ran down the floor into the drain. Leo Kovalensky was sentenced to death. That brings us to the end of chapter 16. Fuck. Chapter 17. It was her last chance and she had to take it. A modest house stood before her on a modest street that lay deserted in the darkness. An old landlady opened the door and looked at Kira suspiciously. Comrade Taganov did not receive women visitors, but she said nothing and shuffled, leading Kira down a corridor, then stopped, pointing at a door and shuffled away. Kira knocked. His voice said, "Come in." She entered. He was sitting at his desk and he was about to rise, but he didn't. He sat looking at her and then rose very slowly, so slowly that she wondered how long she stood there at the door while he was rising, his eyes never leaving her. Then he said, "Good evening, Kira." "Good evening, Andre. Take your coat off." She was suddenly frightened, uncomfortable, uncertain. She lost all the bitter, hostile assurance that had brought her here. Obediently, she took off her coat and threw her hat on the bed. It was a large bare room with whitewashed walls, a narrow iron bed, one desk, one chair, one chest of drawers, no pictures, no posters, but books, an ocean of books and papers and newspapers running over the desk, over the chest, over the floor. He said, "It's cold tonight, isn't it?" "It's cold." "Sit down." She sat by the desk. He sat on the bed, his hands clasping his knees. She wished he would not look at her like that every second of every long minute. But he said calmly, "How have you been, Kira? You look tired." "I am a little tired." "How is your job?" "It isn't." "What?" "Reduction of staffs." "Oh, Kira, I'm sorry. I'll get you another one." "Thanks, but I don't know whether I need one." "How is your job?" "The GPU? I've been working hard, searching searches, arrests. You still aren't afraid of me, are you?" "No, I don't like searches." "Do you like arrests?" "I don't mind when it's necessary." They were silent, and then she said, "Andre, if I make you uncomfortable, I'll go." "No, don't go. Please don't go." He tried to laugh. "Make me uncomfortable? What makes you say that? I'm just a little embarrassed. This room of mine, it's in no condition to receive such a guest." "Oh, it's a nice room. Big, light. You see, I'm home so seldom when I am, I just have time to fall in bed without noticing what's around me." "Oh." They were silent. How is your family, Kira? They are fine, thank you. I often see your cousin, Victor Dunaev, at the institute. Do you like him? No, neither do I. They were silent. Victor has joined the party, said Kira. I voted against him, but most of them were eager to admit him. I'm glad you voted against him. He's the kind of party man I despise. What kind of party man don't you despise, Kira? Your kind, Andre. Kira, it began as a sentence but stopped on the first word. She said resolutely, Andre, what have I done? He looked at her and frowned and looked aside, shaking his head slowly. Nothing. Then he asked suddenly, why did you come here? It's been such a long time since I saw you last. 2 months, day after tomorrow. Unless you saw me at the institute 3 weeks ago. I saw you. She waited, but he did not explain, and she tried to ignore it. Her words almost a plea. I came because I thought maybe you wanted to see me. I didn't want to see you. She rose to her feet. Don't go, Kira. Andre, I don't understand. He stood facing her. His voice was flat, harsh as an insult. I didn't want you to understand. I didn't want you to know. But if you want to hear it, you will hear it. I never wanted to see you again because his voice was like a dull whip. Because I love you. Her hands fell limply against the wall behind her. He went on. Don't say it. I know what you're going to say. I've said it to myself again and again and again. I know every word, but it's useless. I know I should be ashamed, and I am, but it's useless. I know that you liked me and trusted me because we were friends. It was beautiful and rare, and you have every right to despise me. She stood, pressed to the wall, not moving. When you came in, I thought, send her away. But I knew that if you went away, I would run after you. And I thought, I won't say a word. But I knew that you would know it before you left. I love you. I know you would think kindlier of me if I said that I hate you. She said nothing. She cringed against the wall, her eyes wide, her glance holding no pity for him, but a plea for his pity. You're frightened? Do you see why I couldn't face you? I knew what you felt for me and what you could never feel. I knew what you would say, how your eyes would look at me. When did it start? I don't know. I knew only that it must end because I couldn't stand it to see you and laugh with you and talk of the future of humanity and think only of when your hands would touch mine, of your feet in the sand, the little shadow on your throat, your skirt blowing in the wind, to discuss the meaning of life and wonder if I could see the line of your breast in your open collars. She whispered, Andre, don't. It was not an admission of love, it was the confession of a crime. Why am I telling you all this? I don't know. I'm not sure I'm really saying it to you. I've been crying it to myself so often, for such a long time. You shouldn't have come here. I'm not your friend. I don't care if I hurt you. All you are to me, only this. I want you, she whispered. Andre, I didn't know. I didn't want you to know. I tried to stay away from you, to break it. You don't know what it's done to me. There was one search, there was one woman. We arrested her. She rolled on the floor in her nightgown at my feet, crying for mercy. I thought of you. Thought of you there on the floor, in your nightgown, crying for pity as I have been crying for you so many months. I would take you and I wouldn't care if it were the floor and if those men stood looking. Afterward, perhaps I would shoot you and shoot myself, but I wouldn't care because it would be afterwards. I thought I could arrest you in the middle of the night and carry you wherever I wanted and have you. I could do it, you know. I laughed at the woman and kicked her. My men stared at me. They had never seen me do that. They took the woman to jail and I found an excuse to run away to walk home alone, thinking of you. Don't look at me like that. You don't have to be afraid that I would do it. I have nothing to offer you. I cannot offer you my life. My life is 28 years of that of for which you feel contempt. And you are everything I've always expected to hate. But I want you. I would give everything I have, everything I could ever have, Kira, for something You can't give me. He saw her eyes open wide at a thought he could not guess. She breathed. What did you say, Andre? I said everything I have for something you can't. It was terror in her eyes, a terror of the thought that she had seen for a second so very clearly. She whispered, trembling, Andre, I would better go. I would better go now. But he was looking at her fixedly, approaching her, asking in a voice suddenly very soft and low, or is it something you can, Kira? She was not thinking of him. She was not thinking of Leo. She was thinking of Maria Petrovna and of the red bubble on dying lips. She was pressed to the wall, cornered, her 10 fingers spread apart on the white plaster. His voice, his hope were driving her on. Her body rose slowly against the wall, to her full height, higher on tiptoe, her head thrown back so that her throat was level with his mouth, when she threw at him, I can. I love you. She wondered how strange it was to feel a man's lips that were not Leo's. She was saying yes for a long time, but I didn't know that you too. And she felt his hands and his mouth, and she wondered whether this was joy or torture to him and how strong his arms were. She hoped it would be quick. The street light beyond the window made a white square and a black cross on the wall above the bed. Against the white square, she could see his face on the pillow. He did not move. Her arms stretched limply against his naked body, felt no movement but the beating of his heart. She threw the blanket off and sat up, crossing her arms over her breast, her hands clenching her bare shoulders. Andre, I'm going home. Kira, not now, not tonight. I have to go. I want you here till morning. I have to go. There's my family, Andre. We'll have to keep this very secret. Kira, will you marry me? She did not answer. He felt her trembling. He pulled her down and tucked the blanket under her chin. Kira, why does that frighten you? Andre, I can't. I love you. Andre, there's my family. You're a communist. You know what they are. You must understand they have suffered so much. If I marry you, it would be too much for them. If they learn about this, we can spare them. Does it make any difference to us? No, not if you want it that way. Andre, yes, Kira. You'll do anything I want? Anything. I want only one thing. Secrecy. Complete secrecy. You promise? Yes. You see, with me, there's my family. With you, there's the party. I'm not the kind of a mistress your party would approve. So it's better. You see, it's a dangerous thing we are doing. A very dangerous thing. I want to try not to let it break our lives. Break our lives, Kira. He was laughing happily, pressing her hand to his lips. It's better if no one, not a soul anywhere knows this, but you and I. No, Kira, I promise. No one will know, but you and I. And now I'll go. No, please don't go tonight. Just tonight. You can explain to them somehow. Make up a reason. Just stay. I can't let you go. Please, Kira, just to see you here when I awaken. Good night, Kira. She lay very still for a long time until he was asleep. Then she slipped noiselessly out of the bed and, holding her breath, her bare feet soundless on the cold floor, she dressed hurriedly. He did not hear her open the door and slip out. There was a wind whistling down the long, empty streets and a sky like pencil lead. She walked very fast. She knew there was something she had to escape, and she tried to hurry. The dark grass panes were watching her, following her in rows and rows of them, on guard along her way. She walked faster. Her steps beat too loudly, and the houses of the whole city threw echoes back at her. Echoes screaming something. She walked faster. The wind whirled her coat, raising it high over her knees, hurling it between her legs. She walked faster. She passed the poster of a worker with a red banner. The worker was laughing. Suddenly she was running like a shivering streak between dark shop windows and lamp posts. Her coat whistling, her steps beating like a machine gun, her legs flashing and blending like the spokes of a wheel into one circle of motion carrying her forward. She was running or flying or being rocketed through space by something outside her body, and she knew it was all right. Everything was all right if only she could run faster and faster and faster. She came panting up the stairs. At the door, she stopped. She stopped and stood looking at the doorknob, panting. And suddenly she knew that she could not go in, that she could not take her body into Leo's room, into his bed, close to his body. She ran her fingertips over the door, feeling it, caressing it uncertainly, for she could come no closer to him. She sat down on the steps. She felt as if she could hear him somewhere behind that door, sleeping, breathing with effort. She sat there for a long time, her eyes empty. When she turned her head and saw that the square of the window on the landing was dark, bright blue, which was not night any longer, she got up, took her key, and went in. Leo was asleep. She sat by the window, gathered into a tight huddle. He would not know what time she had come home. Leo was leaving for the south. His bag was packed, his ticket was bought, his place was reserved in a private sanatorium in Yalta and a month paid for in advance. She had explained about the money. You see, when I wrote to your aunt in Berlin, I also wrote to my uncle in Budapest. Oh, yes, I have an uncle in Budapest. You have never heard of him mentioned before. Because you see, there's a family quarrel behind it, and he left Russia before the war, and my father forbade us to ever mention his name. But he's not a bad fellow, and he's always liked me, so I wrote him, and that's what he sent. And he said he would help me as long as I need it, but please don't ever mention it to my family because father would. You understand? She wondered dimly how simple and easy it was to lie. To Andre, she had mentioned her starving family. She did not have to ask. He gave her his whole monthly salary and told her to leave him only what she could spare. She had expected it, but it was not an easy moment when she saw the bills in her hand. Then she remembered the comrade commissar and why one aristocrat who could die in the face of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, and she kept most of the money with a hard, bright smile. It had not been easy to convince Leo to go. He said he would not let her or her uncle keep him. He said it tenderly and he said it furiously. It took many hours and many evenings. Leo, your money or my money or anyone's money, does it really matter? Who made it matter? But you want to live, I want you to live. So much is still possible to us. You love me, don't you love me enough to live for me? I know it will be hard. 6 months, all winter. I'll miss you, but we can do it, Leo. I love you. I love you. I love you so much. So much is still possible. She won. His train was to leave at 8:15 in the evening. At 9 she would meet Andre. She had asked him to take her to the opening of a new cabaret. Leo was silent when they left their room, and in the cab on the way to the station she went into the car with him to see the wooden bench on which he was to sleep for many nights. She had bought a pillow for him and a warm plaid blanket. Then they stepped out again and waited on the platform by the car. They had nothing to say. When the first bell rang, Leo said, Please, Kira, don't let's have any nonsense when the train starts. I won't look out of the window, no waving or running after the train or anything like that. No, Leo. She looked at the poster on a steel pillar. It promised a huge orchestra, foreign foxtrots, and delicious food at the grand opening of the new cabaret. At 9 o'clock tonight, she said, wondering, bewildered, a little frightened, as if realizing it for the first time. Leo, at 9 o'clock tonight, you won't be here anymore. No, I won't. The third bell rang. He seized her roughly and held her lips in a long, choking kiss, as long as the train whistle that wailed shrilly. Shrilly. He whispered, Kira, my own only one, I love you. I love you so much. He leaped to the steps of the car as it started moving and disappeared inside. He did not come to the window. She stood and heard iron chains stretching, wheels grinding rails, the engine panting far ahead, white steam spreading slowly under the steel vaults. The yellow squares of windows were suddenly pulled past her. The station smelt of carbolic acid. A faded red banner hung on a steel girder. The windows were steaming faster and faster, melting into a yellow line. There was nothing ahead but steel, steam, smoke, and under an arc very far away, a piece of sky black as a hole. And suddenly she understood that it was a train, and that Leo was on the train, and that the train was leaving her. And something beyond terror, immense and unamiable, something which was not human feeling, seized her. She ran after the train. She grasped an iron handle. She wanted to stop it. She knew that there was something huge and implacable moving over her, which had to stop, which she alone was to stop and couldn't. She was jerked forward, falling. She was whirled along down the wooden planks of the platform, and then a husky soldier in a peaked khaki cap with a red star grabbed her by the shoulder and tore her off the handle and threw her aside, pushing her away from the train with his elbow in her breast. He roared, "What do you think you are doing, citizen?" That brings us to the end of chapter 17 and part 1. We'll be starting with part 2 after this long break that I have. I have also posted in the community about it. I won't be available till 15th January, and we will continue with the second part on 16th January. If you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe, of course, if you are listening and you are following. Bye bye for now. If you have any kind of feedback, recommendations, suggestions, anything at all, you can reach out to me in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section. Bye bye. Take care. Keep listening and reading. Bye.